I wanted to start with knowing a little bit about your background, your childhood in Italy, and how you came to be politicized as a young man.
Yeah, uh, well, I was born in Italy, in northeastern Italy, in a small provincial town between Turin and Genoa. So in the middle of what once was called the industrial triangle, and I became an activist and I could say a Marxist in the early 70s. So I was a high school student, and so I remember very well my first demonstrations in the spring 1973. So I was not yet 16-year-old, but I became an activist, and I said a Marxist. At that time, becoming an activist and a Marxist at 15 or 16 years old wasn't exceptional at all. It was quite common for people belonging to my generation. And so, of course, my Marxism wasn't so sophisticated. But I remember that we had hard discussions about the discrepancies between Marxism and anarchism, the proletarian dictatorship and the abolition of the state, or between reform and revolution, and so on. So at that time, when you went to a bookshop, you could easily find so all classical of Marxism in pocket, very cheap pocket editions. So I think that in my early 20s, I already achieved quite solid Marxist learning culture, and was deeply involved in all the debates of the radical left of that time.
Right, and I think, as you've said elsewhere, your parents were communists or sympathizers of the Italian Communist Party. So, for you, they were the establishment, and so it's natural in that case to look to the far left as an alternative. But of course, Italy in the 1970s had perhaps one of the richest panoply of far left currents in the world, certainly in Europe. You had various forms of Maoism and Guevarism. You had operaismo. You had also the people from Manifesto group who had been expelled from the Communist Party and later went on to form Democrazia Proletaria, etc. So what was it? Why did you choose the most insignificant and weakest section of the Italian far left, the Trotskyists, and what was it that attracted you to them rather than the many other stronger currents that existed?
Yeah, well, maybe a small premise is necessary. So I could say that I belong to the generation of the so-called long 68. But I came to politics and also to this very vibrant intellectual life of Marxism at that time in the early 70s. So in the revolutionary left, extra-parliamentary left of that time, there were a lot of organizations led by people who were a little bit older than me. So when I came, the most crucial choices of my generation had already been made. So, should we stay in the Communist Party or should we leave? Which kind of organization should we build, and so on. So these choices had already been made, and when I came, I had only to choose between a panoply, so a galaxy of left-wing organizations, and I became a Trotskyist not immediately, because in my small provincial town there were no Trotskyists.
Not even a Trotskyist baker, as in one of Nanni Moretti's films.
I met Trotskyists in Genoa and Milano before going to the universities, but anyhow, so Trotsky was a theoretical reference for the intellectual debate at that time. And I became a Trotskyist, I think, because of my interest in history. So I think that the most attractive extra-parliamentary movement at that time was undoubtedly Lotta Continua, because Lotta Continua was open. Everybody could participate in their activities and be involved in initiatives, and they were very radical. And in Lotta Continua, well, maybe more than in other organizations, there was an extremely refreshing social mix. So you could find industrial workers, high school professors, university students, and even professors. And so there was a very vibrant and beautiful atmosphere. But so theoretically speaking, I think that the most creative and original Marxist current in those years was operaism, so workerism, particularly at that time in Toni Negri's version, because Mario Tronti's operaismo was over. He had already joined the Communist Party, and he had already started theorizing the so-called autonomy of the political, and he was in the Communist Party. But the workerism, the autonomia operaia, was almost exclusively focused on factories, on class struggle, on the mass worker. I remember that a very discussed book published by Toni Negri at that moment was a book on Lenin, in which Lenin's theory of the Revolutionary Party was interpreted through the category of class composition. So the structure of the Revolutionary Party almost corresponded with the structure of the factory. So they were almost indifferent to the history of the workers' movement and to the political debates that had deeply shaped the history of socialism and communism in the 19th and the 20th century. So I think that it is through my interest in history that I discovered Isaac Deutscher's biography of Trotsky. I discovered also Perry Anderson, that at that time was quite close to Trotskyism and whose books on Western Marxism and on Gramsci were were hugely read and discussed. I remember that. So I also read Roman Rozdolsky I became a Trotskyist through this way, but always with some hesitations and also with this consciousness that Trotskyists were not so effective in Italy at that time. So they were out of these strategic debates. At that time, their perspective was not the building of a Bolshevik organization, but rather playing the role of the critical consciousness of these large constellation of revolutionary left, so because they thought that they were alone in a very radical and very large new left without father, an orphan far left, they were alone with a historical trajectory, with a historical and theoretical background, and they thought that they could have this way, filled the vacuum left by Trotskyism in 1968, when the Trotskyist movement in Italy almost imploded because they were deeply convinced, Livio Maitan in particular, that any new radical wave, both in the factories, in the workers' movement, and in the student movement, would have taken place within the Communist Party. They thought that the Communist Party was the unavoidable channel of all new wave of social and political transformation. And this prediction was completely wrong. Because in the 60s in Italy, a new working class had happened, a new working class of mostly made of southern Italian immigrants, without the workers' culture and also the work ethic of the older and northern working class members of the unions and of the Communist Party, because a new young generation had happened which could accede for the first time in the Italian history to the high schools and university. And they were not attracted at all by the Communist Party. So So Trotskyism paid the very high price of its incomprehension of a lot of transformations that had taken place in Italy since the 60s. And their clairvoyance, so their maybe broader historical perspective related to the history of socialism, communism, the conflict between Stalinism and Trotskyism, etc. At that moment, in the early 70s, wasn't a big help for making them attractive or effective.
As a footnote, I'd never understood how the sort of super Pabloism of Maidan, with that perspective of focusing on the Communist Party in Italy, how it is relatable to his support for the quote-unquote ultra-left line in Latin America of armed struggle and so on, which is seems to be a contradiction. Obviously, there are two different social contexts and political contexts, but there seems to be something odd in that combination.
Well, I think that during the 70s, everybody shared a common view of colonial revolutions as, speaking with Ernest Mondel, one of the main sectors of the world revolution. But for us, anti-colonialism was a quite abstract notion. Because the radical left in Italy in the 70s was the radical left of a country which had completely eclipsed and forgotten its colonial past. I remember. So I think that I never found in a bookshop a book written by a left-wing historian, for instance, on the Ethiopian War, or on the relationship between anti-fascism and anti-colonialism in the 30s. Anti-colonialism simply meant the Vietnam War. And, the Vietnam War was very far. And we weren't in the United States, in which young people were mobilizing against their own imperialism, deeply involved in an imperial war. So, and we also didn't have the experience of other European movements. Speaking of the Fourth International, for instance, of France, the UK, or even the Netherlands. So. Organizations that had participated in the Algerian War, for instance. So the Algerian War was very far and almost unknown, because the Algerian War didn't have a strong European impact, anyhow, not comparable with the Vietnam War. So there were, maybe we could mention Gillo Pontecorvo, who was more or less connected to the Communist Party, but who was one of the representatives of this Italian tradition of anti-colonialism, the author of the Battle of Algiers, so anti-colonialism was a quite abstract notion, and also.
Yeah.
Maybe we could say that Italy at that time still was a country of emigration, not a country of immigration. There was a huge internal immigration, but there wasn't in Italy a post-colonial intelligentsia involved in these movements, in these debates.
You were in Italy in this very rich political and intellectual culture that stretched all the way from the Communist Party through to the far left, and also included left-wing socialism and so on and so forth, with certain classic figures such as Gramsci and Croce and Labriola as a heritage, and you came to write a PhD on Marxism and the Jewish question in Paris with Michael Levy as your supervisor, and then continue to work on Germanic or Central European intellectuals. Why did you? What attracted you in that direction rather than doing research on the Italian history and Italian intellectuals?
Well, I think that I came to the so-called Jewish question through the Marxism. So, but we are speaking now of the mid-80s, when I moved to Paris and I started investigate for my PhD, and at that moment I had this feeling, so that I had to rethink the history of Marxism. And rethinking and reinterpreting the history of Marxism not only as a current of thought, not only in the perspective, in the quite conventional perspective of the history of ideas. And I think that most intellectual debates, Marxist intellectual debates of the previous years had been philological debates or debates that belonged to the history of ideas. So quite disconnected from the social history of the intellectuals who embodied these ideas. And trying to rethink the history of Marxism as a social history of ideas, I found these, so how we could say, these the Jewish question. It is the very problematic, conflicting, and at the same time unescapable, so deep relationship between Marxism and the Jews. And this was the starting point of my investigation. Usually, so I faced a very huge literature on Jewish history, and a very huge literature on the history of Marxism as two parallel but disconnected or separated currents of thought. And I tried to investigate their interaction. They were deeply interwoven, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe. Of course, I never thought that Marxism could be reducible to the Jews, or that the cultural history of Judaism could be completely reshaped by Marxism. I came from a country in which Marxism has a quite significant history, in which the Jews played an almost insignificant role. And we could, of course, study the history of Marxism in Latin America or in Asia without paying attention to the Jews. But considering classical Marxism, which was born in Central Europe and also in Western Europe, but which spread from Germany and Central Europe. So at that moment, it's impossible not being struck by this interaction between Judaism and Marxism. And so, roughly speaking, I could say that this meeting, this encounter, took place under very particular historical circumstances. The Jewish world in Central Europe was deeply affected by a process of modernization and secularization that produced a quite significant social layer, a Jewish intelligentsia, which was growingly opposed to Judaism as a religious background, and which was, socially speaking, very precarious and marginalized, which was struck by anti-Semitism, and which was very attracted by all new intellectual currents which were avant-garde aesthetic and intellectual currents, which were politically opposed to the established order and to the ruling ideas, so to both liberalism and conservatism, and which couldn't become nationalists, because nationalism was completely reshaped by anti-Semitism. And so this Jewish intelligentsia almost naturally met Marxism and became one of the most important matrix of the renewal and transformation of Marxism after Marx. So since at the end of the 19th century.
And of course, in your book, a much more recent book on the end of Jewish modernity, you trace the unraveling of that entire complex. You continue to work on this question of social history of intellectuals, and also the relationship to Jewish history and the memory of the Holocaust. But what led you to write your book on Siegfried Kracauer? Because Kracauer is generally not the author that Marxists are most interested in amongst the critical thinkers of the 20s and 30s. They're usually more attracted to people like Horkheimer, Adorno, Benjamin, or Marcuse. What was it about Kracauer that attracted you so much that you did this scholarship on him?
Yeah, I came to Kracauer through the Frankfurt School. And so I read Walter Benjamin and Adorno much earlier than Kracauer. But I was very interested in Kracauer, and I wished to introduce this very peculiar and at that time neglected figure into what we could call the critical thought, or in the early 90s, because I found in Kracauer an attempt, maybe not completely accomplished, but an attempt at overcoming many limits of the Frankfurt School, not the main limit emphasized by Perry Anderson, this huge discrepancy between theory and practice. So maybe from this point of view, Marcuse would be much more interesting than Kracauer, of course. But Marcuse shouldn't be discovered because he was universally known. Kracauer, on the contrary, at the end of the 80s or at the beginning of the 90s, was known almost exclusively for his book titled From Caligari to Hitler, on the German film of the Weimar years. And I immediately realized that this book certainly was a very controversial and important book, but one book in a broader and extremely rich work, which tried to overcome some huge holes of Frankfurt School, and particularly so, and this is a fascinating topic because it's related also to the personal relationship between Kracauer and Adorno, but Adorno was a kind of iconophobic thinker. So he completely rejected images, and some scholars think that this could be related to a kind of Jewish incompatibility with the reproduction of the image of God, etc. So maybe this is more valuable for Horkheimer rather than for Adorno. But what is clear is for Adorno, all mass culture is a form of alienation, of reification, and is something that has to be radically rejected in order to defend a high and authentic idea of culture. And Kracauer radically contested this idea, and he tried to think mass culture as an authentic cultural and aesthetic creation within the framework of capitalism, of cultural industry, and also of reification, commodity reification. I think that the work, or a large part of Kracauer's work, could be read as a development and a very important extension and development of Walter Benjamin's theory of the work of art in the age of its mechanical reproductibility. Or reproduction. So this produced Kracauer's theory of film. So the idea that in the 20th century images have become means of knowledge, and that we can interpret and not only observe but analyze and interpret the social reality through images. And so what he wrote on photography and on film seemed to me extremely important. Also, so filling this vacuum of Frankfurt School's critical theory. Well, Kracauer also became a philosopher of history, a thinker of history, and after the Second World War, he also experienced, like many other European and Jewish European immigrants in the United States, a form of political de-radicalization of but nonetheless, I thought that Kracauer had to be rediscovered. And I wrote my book when he wasn't very well known. So today the situation is completely different because his complete work has been published in Germany, translated in many languages, and so on. But
indeed, we translated his book on the salaried masses, which is a very interesting book, which sadly has not had the impact that it should have had. And is it fair to say, because I mean, historically speaking, Trotskyism has been pretty dismissive or outrightly hostile to the Frankfurt School? Is it fair to say that it was being in France and being in a context where thinkers that came from the Trotskyist tradition, like Mikhail Levy or Daniel Ben Said and so on, were opening up to and discussing the ideas of particularly Walter Benjamin, created an environment in which it was possible to make that passage from the interest in classical Marxism to the interest in the Frankfurt School.
Yeah, I went to Paris. And I prepared my PhD dissertation under the supervision of Mikhail Levy. And I went to Paris with this precise idea that I would like to work with him. Because I remember that in Italy comparing some texts, I discovered that Carlos Rossi and Mikhail Levy were the same person, because he wrote many of his political texts under the pseudonym of Carlos Rossi. And I was fascinated by Michael's writings. I had read in Italian translation his book on Lukács, for instance, many texts essays he had written on the theory of permanent revolution, on Rosa Luxemburg, on Trotsky, and also on Max Weber. So I was fascinated by Michael Loewy because, and I think this is maybe the strength of his work, and it will be his legacy for 21st century Marxism. I think he is the first scholar who merged two completely different traditions. The tradition of Central European sociology, Max Weber and Karl Mannheim in particular, the tradition of the Frankfurt School and Western Marxism, first Lukács and then the Frankfurt School, with another usually completely separated tradition, which is the tradition of Latin American Guevarismo and revolution. So the reception of the Frankfurt School and of Benjamin in particular, but also of Lukács, was so either very orthodox in the intellectuals of the Communist Party reading, interpreting Lukács, or an aesthetic reception. So he was able to merge these two traditions. The Latin American tradition, which in the 60s and the 70s was, how to say that, very hot tradition of revolutionary Marxism. Marxism not only as a theory for interpreting the world, but Marxism as a project for changing the world. And so he was able to reread Walter Benjamin in this revolutionary perspective. And so I found that extremely productive, fruitful, and useful for my own work, because I tried to adopt this perspective in rereading the relationship between Marxism and Judaism, between Marxism and the Jewish intellectuals. But so this meant that, so maybe this is the disadvantage of this, this meant working in Paris with a sociologist of culture who was very marginal with respect to the overwhelmingly hegemonic current of French sociology, which was very positivistic, and which came this tradition going from I would say almost Auguste Comte in the 19th century till Bourdieu in the 20th century, and so Michael's reinterpretation of Max Weber and Mannheim put him outside of this tradition of which is very rich of French sociology, and this pushed me also outside of the entire tradition of French structuralism. So I discovered Michel Foucault quite late, so in the 90s, I think. So I discovered in the sense that I started reading seriously Foucault, and also working with the Foucauldian categories like I don't know, microphysics of power or biopolitics and so on, quite late. And from this point of view, I think that the major help came not from Michael Levy, but rather from Daniel Ben Said, who was a friend, despite a certain generational discrepancy. He was 10 years older than me. But I think that in the late 80s, and particularly after the historical turn of 1989, Daniel had this intuition that the tradition of Trotskyism and also of what was called revolutionary Marxism, which had its own theoretical references, and which in France had built itself against structuralism. So in the 70s, many intellectuals related to the Ligue communiste révolutionnaire published a book titled Against Althusser. They were more sectarian than the New Left Review in the UK, for instance. But after 1989, I think that Daniel understood that this tradition had to be rethought and had to be put into question, not in order to reject it, but rather in order to open its boundaries to other currents of thought. And post-structuralism became a valuable interlocutor for many intellectuals. And I think that Daniel Ben Said played an important role in this. So it was possible to discuss with Derrida, for instance, or it was possible to work with the Foucauldian categories without rejecting the tradition of Marx, Rosa Luxemburg, Trotsky, and Ernest Mondel.
Although perhaps it's worth noting that in the French context, so-called post-structuralism did not have the same function and role intellectually as it did, particularly in the Anglophone world, via its translation through the American reception of it, where it became a force that was very hostile to Marxism and resulted in post-Marxism and various polemics with Marxists. In France, it doesn't, in the same period, it doesn't have that function. It's something that's parallel to Marxism, but not in direct conflict with it.
It wasn't the French theory, the so-called French theory. But I think that something that happened in France, thanks to Daniel, also happened in Italy. So what is called the Italian thought or Italian theory is something that was born, in this case, I think, from of a break with a very large tradition of Italian culture shaped by Croce's historicism and Gramsci's historicism that came till Pasolini and Levi, what we call today Italian thought, is something different. Behind Agamben, we can find Heidegger and Walter Benjamin and Foucault. and structuralism. And this is something that means a very significant break with the tradition of... So many things happened in the 90s, between the 80s and 90s, that changed our intellectual and theoretical references. And I think that Daniel helped us to tenir le cap. I don't know which is the...
maintain a perspective. A perspective that was one of what he called open dogmatism.
Yeah. I don't know if this oxymoronic definition is, so he would have liked that, but maybe something like that.
Yeah. Well, it was his formulation, I think. So to jump ahead a bit, one of the things that you then engaged in, which is perhaps surprising in a post-89 context, or perhaps not, is to seek to rehabilitate or retrieve a left version of critique of totalitarianism. Surprising because, as we know, totalitarianism was, a concept in the Anglophone world, at least in its reception, seen as something that forged during the Cold War by anti-communists, and in the French context, something that was forged by the new intellectuals of the late 70s and the 80s, again in an anti-Marxist, with an anti-Marxist perspective. And yet you sought in your book on totalitarianism to retrieve a different current, a left current of critique of totalitarianism. What was the motivation there?
Yeah, I think that I was interested in the history of the idea of totalitarianism because it seemed to me that it was related to the history of political exile and to the history of the intellectuals in the 20th century. So I thought that at least at the beginning, it is till the Cold War, till the beginning of the Cold War, the idea of totalitarianism contained some hermeneutic potentialities. This idea tried to answer a very pertinent question: what is fascism? What is National Socialism? Why Auschwitz? Why Stalinism? So many scholars who were not necessarily, and most of them were marginal intellectuals, were exile scholars, tried to answer this question. So the first half of the 20th century produced a new symbiotic relationship between ideas and violence, between politics and violence. And the first half of the 20th century produced new political regimes that cannot be classified with the political categories inherited from the 19th century or previous years. So something different with respect to tyranny or despotism or so authoritarian dictatorships. Fascism means something new. The idea that totalitarianism was an attempt at destroying politics defined as so the interaction between human beings and politics as a public sphere in which the diversity of humanity can be expressed and represented. So I think that the idea of totalitarianism contained some intuitions. And the idea of totalitarianism at that time also belonged to the heretical currents of Marxism. Victor Serge, I think, was the first intellectual who used this adjective totalitarian to define Stalin's USSR. And Trotsky spoke of totalitarianism with respect to both Stalin's Russia and Hitler's Germany. And at the end of the Second World War, but also during the Second World War, Franz Neumann, Herbert Marcuse, and then in France, Socialisme ou Barbarie. So a constellation of marginal figures of heretical Marxism accepted the idea of totalitarianism. It is with the Cold War that totalitarianism was codified as anti-communism, as the dominant ideology of the so-called free world against. And so my book on totalitarianism is an attempt at rediscovering this hidden tradition of left-wing totalitarianism, anti-totalitarianism, with also the consciousness that many, and maybe also most, left-wing scholars who very early analyzed and criticized totalitarianism became anti-totalitarian liberals. So during the Cold War, they choose their field, which was the field of. So I don't say that all of them joined the Congress for Cultural Freedom, but many of them did. So the history of the idea of totalitarianism should be rediscovered in its complexity beyond some cliché which are quite and some commonplaces.
In your work on the origin of Nazi violence, and then the book on the interwar period, the European Civil War, a similar concern with trying to understand the origins and nature of both Nazism, which in the origin of Nazi violence you give a kind of genealogy of the growth of organized state violence to show that Nazism is a sort of paroxystic example of a long tradition rather than just being a purely exceptional phenomenon. And in the book on the European Civil War, you show that both fascism and Stalinism are the product of this this period of revolution and counter-revolution and war of the interwar period. So I think can demonstrate there are similar concerns as in the book on totalitarianism, and yet you here are engaging in a more present-day concern with an intervention in historical disputes of today, or at least of the last few decades. The historians' debate in Germany, for example, or the various attempts to characterize the whole of the history of communism as necessarily resulting in Stalinism. And in the book on the European Civil War, is it fair to say that the Fire and Blood in English, is it fair to say that the two kind of figures intellectually that are sort of haunting the book are one, Arne Meyer and his work on revolution and counter-revolution, and on the other hand, but as a counterposed to Ernst Nolte in his book, The European Civil War. Is that a fair characterization of the kind of two main figures of intellectual debate in that book, Meyer versus Nolte?
I think so. My book, Fire and Blood, was a kind of prolongation of my previous book on Nazi violence. So this book on Nazi violence was an historiographical intervention, quite polemical, because when I wrote this book, we were in a time in which the historiography of the Holocaust was completely closed within a kind of Jewish paradigm. So it was the time in which we started speaking of the Holocaust studies. The investigation on the history of the Holocaust had become a discipline. But this discipline focused almost exclusively on the history of anti-Semitism in Germany, and on the history of National Socialism as a kind of pathological historical phenomenon whose roots were German. Which is a truism. It's obvious that the roots of National Socialism are German. But the purpose of my book was to analyze the European roots of National Socialism and also of the Holocaust. So I thought that the history of anti-Semitism was obviously one of the pillars in the process of the building of National Socialism and the matrix of the Holocaust. But I also think, I'm deeply convinced that anti-Semitism alone is not enough to explain both National Socialism and the Holocaust. The Holocaust was a crucible, was the product of the exceptional junction of several historical tendencies, which were anti-Semitism, radical nationalism on the one hand, but also anti-Bolshevism, anti-communism, So the most radical version of counter-enlightenment focused on communism as the radical or the latest expression or product of enlightenment, and also colonialism. That the idea of Lebensraum, of the the war on the Eastern Front, conceived of like so as a war of conquest and of extermination. This was the product of the large history of European colonialism and imperialism going beyond the frontiers of Germany. And I also stressed that the history of the Holocaust could be inconceivable without the transformation of violence that took place during the First World War, with a dramatic loss of value of human life, with the first experiences of serial killing, industrial killing, and so on. So the Holocaust could be understandable considering all these premises. And as you said, so I found in Arno Meyer a great historian whose relationship with Marxism was very important, even if never put forward, not emphasized, but was quite important. And my book was an attempt at rethinking the history of National Socialism, developing some intuitions of Arno Meyer, and then. So my book titled Fire and Blood enlarged the perspective. So the Holocaust studies, I think, had become at the turn of the 21st century a kind of epistemological obstacle in order to thinking the history of the 20th century. Because this exclusive focus on the Holocaust eclipsed or shadowed a much broader landscape in which the Holocaust becomes understandable. And this landscape is a landscape of wars, of a new kind of violence, of wars which tend to become civil wars or total wars, which are fought like civil wars, and wars in which violence take a new qualitative dimension, and wars in which the actors change. And the century of totalitarianism, genocides, and total wars is also the century of these titanic or titanesque confrontation, clash between revolution and counter-revolution. And I think that the intelligibility of the 20th century requires inscribing this clash between revolution and counter-revolution in this very large landscape. And so Fire and Blood is also the result of this new perspective in historical investigation. But this also meant reinterpreting some representatives of both critical theory and right-wing or conservative political thought. So Carl Schmitt plays a very important role in my book, because this age of civil wars, or this age of total wars fought like civil wars, id est lawless wars without shared rules between the belligerents, and wars in which many forms of violence coexisted, meant reinterpreting the role of the actors, considering both critical theory and conservative political thought. There, I found many symmetries, which are certainly not equivalencies, but symmetries between Gramsci's theory of revolution, of strategy, in his prison notebooks, and Carl Schmitt's theory of the political, for instance, or between Lenin and Trotsky's writings at the time of the Russian Civil War, and the later Schmitt's theory of the partisan. So the age of the European Civil War is an age which cannot be interpreted with the political categories of not only of classical but also of 20th century liberalism. So Habermas, Bobbio are perfectly useless in order to analyzing the conflicts that shaped Europe and the world between the First and the Second World War. On the contrary, Lenin, Trotsky, Gramsci, and Ernst Junger or Carl Schmitt can become very useful when pertinently used and approached with the necessary precautions, of course.
So related to the discussion on Nazism and the Holocaust, you more recently wrote the book, New Face of Fascism, the book behind you. You analyse the rise of the new far right in Europe and beyond. You point out all the differences between the forms of the new far right and classical fascism, the context of revolution and counter-revolution, the relationship to the bourgeois state, if you like, the question of parliamentary democracy, the absence of organized militias, and so on and so forth. And you argue that it's more accurate to characterize these new far-right forces, at least at the moment, as forms of what you call post-fascism. But I was wondering whether you don't think that there's a problem with sort of reifying the classical forms of fascism as the standard with which you judge all subsequent forms of far-right thought or practice. You know, in the same way that communism has had many varieties, Maoism, Trotskyism, etc., council communism, why can't we have many varieties of fascism? And secondly, in the same way that communists have debated how they had to adapt their tactics and strategy in relation to their defeats in the past, so the debates on Eurocommunism and so on in the 1970s, shouldn't we also allow for the fact that fascists also think through their defeats and try and adapt their strategy and tactics in order to be more effective? So yeah, that's my question to you. Isn't the problem with calling it post-fascism is that one forecloses that and assumes that there is something different, and those questions get perhaps forgotten.
Yeah, well, my book is titled The New Faces of Fascism, and I think it's a good title. By the way, I think that maybe you chose this title. I'm quite clear, I think, in the introduction about the way in which I use both the concept of fascism and try to introduce the concept of post-fascism. Post-fascism includes fascism. And it's quite obvious that when we speak of democracy, we don't think that our liberal democracies or our democratic regimes are the same thing that Pericles' democracy in ancient Athens. But nonetheless, we call them democracies. And I think that fascism could perfectly exist in the 21st century with different features with respect to classical or historical fascism. But speaking of post-fascism is a way to emphasize some new characteristics of these radical wing movements, which most of them, the overwhelming majority of them, don't claim the legacy of fascism. All of them insist very much that they are not fascist, that fascism is over. Maybe they are, well, think of Giorgia Meloni in Italy. Till a few months ago, she was very proud of her fascist identity. And now she says that her government is not fascist at all, nothing to see with fascism. At the same time, she is certainly not anti-fascist. Well, but think of Marine Le Pen in France. So in the case of Marine Le Pen, there was a quite serious attempt at break with a tradition embodied by her father, which was an authentic fascist tradition. And we could give a lot of examples. In the United States, there was a big debate on Donald Trump and fascism, and I think that depicting him as a fascist is perfectly coherent, pertinent, and legitimate. But he doesn't have a very clear idea about the history of fascism or about what fascism is. So the concept of post-fascism emphasizes the novelty of these new radical rights, which are maybe the 21st century version of fascism, but which are at the same time something that, on the one hand, we cannot define without permanently compare them to classical fascism, and on the other hand, it's obvious that they are different with respect to classical fascism for a lot of reasons, because of their different relationship with violence, because of their different reference to anti-communism, because very impressive lack of utopianism in their perspective. Historical fascism had a strong utopian dimension. Fascism developed and spread the myth of the new man, the myth of the Tausendjährige Reich, so a kind of palingenetic conception of history. Classical fascism was an attempt to project society towards the future, and it depicted itself as an alternative to both socialism and liberalism. So there was an idea of futurity in historical fascism. All fascist or post-fascist movements of nowadays are deeply conservative, are much more related intellectually, culturally speaking, to the tradition of what in Germany was called Kulturpessimismus, so the cultural despair, a kind of, rather than fascism. So they don't look at the future, they look at the past. And they insist on the defense of traditional values. Against globalization, we defend national sovereignties. Against immigration, we defend the ethnic and cultural roots of the national communities. We defend the Christian roots of Europe against the Islamic invasion, etc., etc. And this discourse is deeply conservative. So the myth of the great replacement, which is quite popular now in the right wing, in the United States, for instance, and in several European countries, is very different with respect to the myth of the Lebensraum. The Lebensraum, or Spazio Vitale, was a project of conquering space, of colonizing, of plundering. The idea of the great replacement, we have to defend ourselves against the invasion, threats, etc., etc. And this is a very conservative approach. I think that in order to organize an effective movement against this new form of fascism, we have to be aware of that. And from this point of view, the lack of futurity, I see a quite significant symmetry with the radical left. Because one of the main problems of the radical left is this incapacity to project the movements of the present into the future.
Okay, let's move on to that. So perhaps one can see your book on left melancholy and revolution as, in some sense, in conversation with each other. The book on left melancholy is addressing, I think it's fair to say, the question of defeat and the post-89 sequence. And the book on revolution is trying to, is also registering defeat, but trying to draw on the cultural and intellectual history of revolution in particularly the 20th century to reassert that it is still a relevant resource for the left today. Is that a fair way of characterizing the two books?
Yeah, I think that you are right. So these two books are deeply connected each other. So this concept of left-wing melancholia, which I didn't invent because so Daniel Ben Said, who we already mentioned, had published a book. I don't think I don't know so whether is it translated into English or not, but Le Pari Mélancolique,
the melancholic wager. Yeah.
Wager. And I think that Raymond Williams wrote about left-wing melancholia. So I didn't invent this concept, but I tried to conceptualize an idea that was quite widespread, but mostly used as a word useful in order to depict an atmosphere or zeitgeist, so rather than a true concept. And I tried to conceptualize the left-wing melancholia, simply explaining that melancholia is a feeling that belongs to the structure of the feelings of the left. Speaking always with Raymond Williams, and that left-wing melancholia is not something that suddenly appeared in 1989 after the fall of the Berlin Wall, but left-wing melancholia is a feeling that always belonged to the history of the left, to its culture. If revolution means changing the world, we cannot change the world simply with good ideas, valuable ideas, or with effective strategies, or with powerful organizations. Changing the world means mobilizing aspirations, hopes, utopias, means new forms of sociability, of acting collectively together. So there are no revolutions without a high level of intensity in human relations. And most revolutions finished in tragic defeats or in authoritarian forms of power. So most revolutions maybe changed the world, but also betrayed their original aspirations. And this inevitably created a kind of melancholy. And that is something that everyone that in his life or her life were involved in a left-wing movement knows. Because you cannot speak with an old communist or activist who participated in the history of resistance without mentioning a lot of people who fell in this. We cannot speak with much younger activists from Latin America, for instance, without speaking about what happened in Chile, in Argentina, in Brazil, in Uruguay, and so on, in Peru, and so on and so on. So this feeling of left-wing melancholia, I think, was for a long time censored, because admitting this melancholia happened as a kind of weakness. A revolutionary movement and in the history of the 20th century, revolution was thought and practiced through a kind of military paradigm. Revolution meant the armed conquering of power. And revolution requires a military organization. And a military organization is made of revolutionary soldiers with hierarchies, with a leadership, with a discipline, etc. And a combatant, a soldier of revolution has to be courageous, has to be strong, has to be somebody who doesn't know fear and who cannot be melancholic. So this was the stereotype that that was very strong and that I think censored these. So my idea of left-wing melancholia means giving a kind of legitimacy to something that always belonged to the history of left-wing culture. We can depict it, we can give it a name, and we can recognize it as a legitimate feeling belonging to our culture, to our history. But what is very important to add is that left-wing melancholia is neither a pathology, a kind of disease of the left that should be cured, and because in the 90s somebody tended to depict left-wing melancholia this way, a product of defeat, and we have to overcome this melancholia in order to become again effective, and nor a therapy. I don't prescribe melancholy as a way to overcoming so these weaknesses. Is something that belongs to our history, and I think that it's possible to write a history of the left-wing melancholia, whose features or traces are much more visible in some iconographic productions, in images or literature, memoirs, or movies, rather than in theoretical productions. It's difficult to find an essay on melancholia in Marx, Lenin, Trotsky, Rosa Luxemburg, but when we read many letters of Rosa Luxemburg or Trotsky, we can find this feeling.
I wanted to return to the question about the end of Jewish modernity, in which you trace the unraveling of the relationship between Jews in general, and particularly Jewish intellectuals, and the ideals of emancipation and progress. And I wanted to ask you, how do you see that thesis now, today, in the context of the war against Gaza being carried out by a government composed of people, some people describe as fascists, in Netanyahu's government, and a war that others are also describing as a war with a genocidal tendency. How would you place the argument that you put about the end of Jewish modernity in this precise context?
Yes, I think that what is happening, the tragedy under our eyes today in Gaza, So unfortunately, I'm not at all happy of that, but unfortunately confirms, it seems to me, what I wrote 10 years ago about the end of Jewish modernity. Because this is the epilogue of nationalistic and in some cases openly fascist concept of view and conception of Judaism. Israel is a state that for decades implemented a project of military expansion by conquering territories, by expelling or segregating Palestinians. So is the accomplishment of an extremely narrow conception of a religious and ethnic state. And it seems to me that a religious and ethnic state is, of course, something irrational, an aberration in the 21st century everywhere. But the paradox is so lazy in the fact that this so narrow ethnic and religious state is a Jewish state, is the antipodal conception of the paradigm of Jewish modernity. Jewish modernity, which is the inscription of the Jews in the modern world as a diasporic minority, as an exterritorial minority, as a minority which historically embodied the critical thought exactly because it couldn't be included in the ruling category of nation-state, whose critical spirit was related to this form of otherness, of incompatibility with all political paradigms of modernity. And the fact that these diasporic, exterritorial, critical, anti-conformistic Jewish form of Judaism was transformed into this paroxystic form of nation-state and of expansionist, militaristic nation-states is a kind of paradox of modernity. And of course, in order to be clear, there is a progressive Jewish tradition. So a powerful demonstration against the war in Gaza took place in New York, London, Paris, and many other capitals in which left-wing associations, Jewish organizations played a very significant role. So this tradition of critical thinking and of progressive still exists, of course. So nonetheless, so these reversal, this authentic reversal took place, and I think that we can depict it as the end of Jewish modernity.